So back in 2020, I, Steven Schinder, started a podcast called Delayed Replay, recapping and reviewing the latest films. However, it got broadcast into an alternate universe where those films got delayed and came out differently from how I was describing them. Because of how me and my guests had been describing the films, people in that other universe were saying that this was all an improvised comedy podcast, which, listening back, I can totally get why they believe that. A lot of weird stuff happened in that first year, and I even met my other self from that other universe, who pops in from time to time, for better or worse. And now, in the year 2023, this podcast continues, still recapping and reviewing movies and sometimes some other things that got delayed or cancelled in that other universe. A new episode Saturdays every other week, unless I decide otherwise for some special reason or whatever. You are listening to Delayed Replay, Season 4.
Hey everyone, first off, before Zach and I talk about the fourth Star Trek Kelvin movie, I just want to bring up a few things really quick. So my new novel, Standalones and Stepping Stones, Trespassing Through the Visages, is out now, currently on ebook, and it will be on paperback and hardcover in the near future as well. And the first book, Lemons Loom Like Rain, is finally on hardcover and is, of course, still available as an ebook and paperback. So here's the blurb for Trespassing Through the Visages, which I'll just read real quick in case any of you are interested. Long ago, every planet was part of a larger planet called Myunis Grund, before the kin conflicts broke the world apart in more ways than one. Now the machinations of those responsible have caught up to people on Earth. A bath bomb turns one's skin into its own separate entity, vying for control. Two murderous brothers who have been on the run break into a family's home and try to avoid being captured. And a man who disappeared as a child tries to set things right as he remembers his sister. Threats loom above in this perilous journey through space and time. So yeah, you can find that on Amazon, and it's very spacey, so kind of on brand to bring it up in this episode. And to that point, I also wanted to include a review of Babylon 5: The Road Home. So that'll be at the end of this episode. It's the new Babylon 5 animated movie. It just came out on Tuesday, same day that my ebook came out. And the physical release, I ordered it so that it would make its way home, to my home. Hey, The Road Home. So I'll talk about that at the end of this, so you won't be spoiled here. And on that note of new movies, watch Blue Beetle. It is a good film. It's very refreshing. Again, no spoilers. I'll probably go more into spoilery discussion on a future episode of Delayed Replay that's more comic book movie themed. I actually watched it right after Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem, so I did kind of a Blue Tint Teetle double feature. And Mutant Mayhem, I didn't really like all that much. Some of the humor felt kind of cringy to me, and it felt like it was kind of trying too hard with a couple of gross out moments. But maybe other people will like it. I seem to be the outlier from the looks of it. But yeah, it does have a nice Star Trek reference. There's a little discussion of who's the better Chris. And so, of course, since it's Paramount, there will be that little nod there, of course. So I thought that was a funny moment, at least. But yeah, Blue Beetle, it was very satisfying, very invested in that character's journey, and it's very self-contained. You don't need to have watched any other DC movies. You could kind of slot it into whatever DC universe you want, really. But yeah, it had heart. I love the music, and I won't go into specifics until a later point. And I'll go into more specifics with Mutant Mayhem on an upcoming delayed replay episode that's more animated movie themed, and I might even throw in a segment about my thoughts on the state of animated movies, recent ones, so that could be interesting. But yeah, so check the timestamps so that you see what's going on after this Star Trek movie discussion. There will be a Strange New Worlds season 2 sort of overall thoughts segment, after I do the plugs at the end. And there will be non spoiler thoughts followed by spoiler thoughts. My friend Liana Ahmed sent in a message to contribute to that. And then after that will be the Babylon 5 The Road Home segment. So for each of those, I'll try to begin with non spoiler stuff and then go into spoiler stuff. So yeah, check the timestamps for this episode. And without further delay, enjoy the discussion. Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of Delayed Replay, that podcast where we recap and review movies that got delayed in that other universe, but came out on time, or somewhat on time, in our universe. I'm your host, as always, Steven Schinder, and joining me to talk about the fourth Kelvin Star Trek movie titled Star Trek Forward, it is Mr. Zach Arnold from IPC and Fandom Empire. How's it going, good sir?
Hey, Steven, thanks so much for having me back. I got to have a little bit of a retrospective and listen in on my last appearance talking about Indiana Jones. And I enjoy the Star Trek universe just as much, if not more so, than the Indiana Jones universe. And so for those to be my two most recent appearances on this program are very fitting. And I'm super excited to be back. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for taking up the invite. So what have been your experiences with Star Trek? Like, how'd you get into it, and what's been your overall journey with the franchise, I guess you could say?
Oh man, Star Trek has been as much of a journey in my life as Star Wars, I would say. I was definitely brought up on Star Wars as a kid. I watched the original trilogy endlessly, especially on the VHS special edition. And anytime I had friends or family over, like we were watching, Return of the Jedi or something like that. And for the longest time, I always considered Star Wars to be the superior Star product. And it wasn't even a discussion in my mind. And something happened around the age of, I want to say 13 or 14. I started watching Star Trek at home with my family. Um, I think it was on the Nintendo Wii. Do you remember when you could watch Netflix on the Nintendo Wii?
I remember being able to watch Netflix on my PlayStation 3, so kind of similar, but
Somewhere
also like,
around those lines. Yeah, very,
yeah.
very early days of streaming before there were smart TVs and Fire Sticks and things like that. You had to open up an application on your gaming system to watch episodes. And we started with The Next Generation because that was a show that my dad watched when he was about my age that I am now. Um, and we watched all the way through Next Generation. We watched all the way through Deep Space Nine, all the way through Voyager. Like, I would say a good part of my late junior high into high school years was surrounded by getting caught up on shows and movies that I had missed out on when I was younger, or was just not around for a period. I mean, Next Generation started before I was born, so um, as I got more exposed to all the different types of Star Trek that are out there, I just became more and more of a fan. And when the '09 Kelvin film came out, I was seeing it like within the first week. I don't think I saw it opening weekend, but I saw it very, very soon after that. And to be able to watch Star Trek in the theaters was just a whole other experience. And after that, I was just on board. I got all of the series on DVD, even Enterprise. Like I would get the complete set, multiple discs. I've got just about every Trek you can imagine. The movies, Kelvin or otherwise, all of the series. I don't have Discovery because I'm waiting for that complete series to be finished before I purchase it. But if it does get released on disc, I'm definitely buying that as well. I would say I'm just as much of a Trekkie as I am anything else. In fact, in some cases, I think there are certain episodes or pieces of Star Trek that I probably find more enjoyable than certain pieces of Star Wars. So that's part of why I do the IPC podcast, because I don't really want to talk about one over the other. I enjoy them both quite a lot.
Yeah, like that's basically the mission statement of the Intergalactic Peace Coalition, like being able to talk about multiple fandoms, which is great, you know?
Oh yeah, yeah. I didn't want to be like completely bound to one franchise because I love the Jurassic franchise, you know. I love the Dark Knight trilogy. I love Indiana Jones. And to be able to have the freedom to talk about any one of those is something that I never try to take for granted. And so I'm just excited that we get to hone in on Star Trek tonight because I'll admit Ben probably isn't as big of a Trek nerd as I am, and rightfully so. He's got a whole huge following regarding Star Wars, and it's a great following. It's a great podcast, but I really love getting to talk Trek with like big Trek fans. So I'm excited for this episode.
Yeah. So as for my Star Trek journey, I remember, well, first off, my grandpa was really into the original series, and I think because of him, my dad really enjoyed it as well, and the movies for that. He may have caught glimpses of the later stuff in the like 80s, 90s, but when me and my older brother Alex were kids, the thing that I remember seeing that was Star Trek related, we probably watched some of the original series cast movies,
Mm.
but the one that I always remembered glimpses of was the voyage home. You know, seeing Spock dive into the like uh, tank that has the whale, and then the ending scene where they're all lined up and have completed their mission and whatever. Um, and I know it's like kind of a can of worms, that movie. Like I know it's very upfront with its message, but I'd argue it's a good message. You know, it's save the whales. And it's also like you might agree or disagree with this, but I think it's got some nice comedic moments, that one. But then apart from that, I wasn't really like growing up. I was more of a Star Wars fan and sort of, I guess, was kind of uh, quote unquote infected with that idea that like you can only like one and that Star Trek is probably not as cool as Star Wars. But then the 2009 reboot movie really caught my older brother's attention and got him back into the franchise in a way. And so I kind of got glimpses of that. And then we watched Into Darkness in the theater. And by that point, I'd started, I was very much the Netflix generation, like you mentioned, and
Mm-hmm.
started going through like the original series. And then after that, in the animated series, I went through, you know, TNG, DS9, Voyager, Enterprise, and then all the movies, and then caught Beyond in the theater. Um, so, and you know, like Into Darkness, I remember liking a lot when I watched it, but in retrospect, like watching it again now, I'm like, you know, there's it's not as enjoyable to me anymore now that I have like all this hindsight of what it did right and what it did wrong. And then Beyond, like I know that Beyond got a lot of praise from fans, but I didn't like it quite as much as the 2009 film. I might be in the minority, but yeah, like basically TNG and DS9 became my top favorites, but I enjoyed all of the series. And then with Paramount Plus, we got like a Trek renaissance with the likes of Discovery, Picard, Strange New Worlds, Prodigy, Lower Decks. So we got a nice variety. And then um, like Discovery kind of became my Star Trek in a way because it was the first one I watched as it aired week to week, and there's something exciting about that. And more recently, I've been really enjoying the current second season of Strange New Worlds. So, and I still love Star Wars, but I think overall I tend to be happier with the Trek television content that's been coming out a bit more so than the Wars content, if that makes sense.
Oh, it completely does. And that's probably the camp that I find myself in too. Like, I think I would probably call Strange New Worlds my show, if that's the description that you're giving. Like, I did watch Discovery, um, probably on a semi-weekly basis, maybe every other week. Um, but I think I have been really looking forward to Strange New Worlds a lot more. I find it to be this great balance of taking you on new adventures and giving you that classic Star Trek sense of completion and wholesomeness, but at the same time expanding the world and giving you new stories. And it's that episodic feel that that show provides that has like a full circle moment where everything is somewhat happily ever after by the end of the episode, and you can kind of feel the way viewers felt in the 60s probably when they were watching their Star Trek. It's like, oh, there's a crisis and it's been resolved, and now you can't wait for next week, but it's okay if you end up missing next week. You can just get caught up or watch this current week and you don't miss a whole lot. So I think Strange New Worlds has kind of become quote unquote my show, and I'm trying my hardest to get my wife into it, but I think I might have to settle for watching The Mandalorian with her. At least I've got her watching a Star Wars show, but I don't know if I can get her into Star Trek all that much.
Right. Yeah. And Star Trek, like I think you have a good point that Strange New Worlds, I think, is sort of the crowd pleaser among the fans. Like Discovery, I feel, was needed in order for Trek to evolve, but Strange New Worlds has like a good mix of classic and new stuff, and you get characters like Nurse Chapel with a more of a personality, and Chris Pike. He's his fate is known, but he can still be optimistic with the time that he still has as captain.
Yep.
And it's very inspiring. And I know there's like the rivalry with the Orville, which, like, when that was airing alongside Discovery, I enjoyed some of the Orville. I thought it had some hits and some misses, but I kind of wish the Orville had aired during the time when we didn't have Trek television, like between Enterprise and Discovery, so that there wouldn't have been such a heated rivalry. But the third season, I thought, had some surprising stuff in ways good and, in my opinion, not so good, but it still became more of its own thing in some ways, which I appreciated. And now with Star Trek, the shows, with the different eras and the different types of storytelling, and you even have animated and live action, like it's such a great mix of new stuff, which I really appreciate.
Well, and then to just add on top of that, a lot of what we had been getting from the Star Trek universe had been on the small screen, and we had to watch them on our phones or on our computers, on our TVs, what have you. Um, since Beyond, it's been several years since we've had any Trek on the big screen, and so to have this new one, it just continues that renaissance even further. I love that word. I love the concept that we're getting a revival of something that has been around for decades, and it's being introduced to a whole new audience, not just on an app, but also in the movie theaters, which is really awesome.
Yeah, for sure. And during like the breaks between seasons or episodes, I find myself like reading some of the like Trek books that you can sometimes get for like 99 cents as ebooks on the Simon and Schuster site. And I've even read some of the comics thanks to Humble Bundle over the years. So like even though the screen stuff is what's considered canon, because Star Trek has parallel universes, it's like any story could be just their own universe, you know? And so it's not that much of a stretch to think of something being valid but in a separate timeline, which we pretty much get with the Kelvin films. As you know, the 2009 movie showed the catalyst that created this new universe without wiping out the old one, and we even get like little acknowledgments of it in Picard. You know, it's part of the backstory in a way, and a brief mention in Discovery season 3 of a character who hopped from one timeline to the other. So it's nice that with this new movie, we now have both of these timelines going on at the same time on the screens.
That is the one area that can be a little confusing for non-Trek fans.
Right, yeah.
Because people like my wife are just like, so he's Spock, and then she sees Ethan Peck when I'm watching Strange New Worlds, and like, but he's also Spock. And so like that is one area of disconnect that can be a little confusing to clarify sometimes. But I personally love the variety of storytelling because, like you said, when you have something that is set in another timeline, in another universe, you have the freedom to tell whatever story you want, and it gives a lot of flexibility for character development, for the writers who are writing the series or the movie. You don't have to worry about those conflicting interests like you do with the Star Wars universe. You know, you've got tons of really great stories that you could tell in Star Wars, but it's all part of the Legends canon. But you can tell different pieces of different canon through different universes with this type of storytelling, and I like the freedom that offers.
Yeah, and I can see how it can be confusing to casual viewers, especially when they put out
Sure.
this movie just a week before Strange New Worlds season 2 premiered. But I guess they really wanted to continue the Trek hype train in a way, which as a Trekkie I'm all for, but I can see how it can be confusing to some.
Sure. It's one of those things that you have to set up your timeline for when you think people are going to view it the most. And summer blockbusters are always the best time for something like that. And so you kind of have to set up a film like this in a time where there should be some relative success at the box office. And I think they did that because some people may only be interested in the Calvin timeline, and some people may only be interested in the Paramount Plus storylines. So it's only, I would call it only a portion of the Venn diagram that overlaps, and probably an even smaller percentage of that overlap that gets confused.
Yeah. So for this one, they've talked with different directors over the years, like Quentin Tarantino, S.J. Clarkson, Noah Hawley, and Matt Shackman. And eventually they decide, okay, we'll just have all of them co-direct this. So with this one, you kind of get interesting pacing because, you know, of the director's different styles. And we'll talk about like how we feel about it as a whole by the end. But what did you think of this decision to use 4 directors at once?
I mean, Tarantino is such a fantastic director that as soon as his name was attached to the project, I was already in. But then you take a look at somebody like S.J. Clarkson, who obviously is not as big of a name as Quentin freaking Tarantino, But you take a look at some of the stuff that she has done, and she's worked on some Netflix series like Jessica Jones and The Defenders. She's been a part of shows like HBO's Succession, and she even was a director on Orange is the New Black and the unaired Game of Thrones prequel pilot. So there are some big, really well written, really good storytelling pieces that are a part of Clarkson's resume. And if you go to IMDb and look up people like Hawley and Shackman as well, you're going to see similar results. And so to have that wealth of experience attached to such a vast universe as Star Trek, I don't really have very many complaints with it. You know, you're right that you can kind of notice when there may be kind of a differentiation in the way that this particular scene is shot, or the lens flare present versus not present, that sort of thing. um, but as a whole, I think part of the beauty is found in the mess, because that's kind of what Star Trek is. It can be a little messy, it can be a little confusing at times. And so to have them find a way to incorporate that into a story that doesn't super detract from the story is actually pretty creative. So I think it would have been interesting to see what somebody like just Tarantino could do with it, but I'm not as opposed to it as I thought I would be.
Right. Like with Tarantino, I think part of the reason for this idea was he wasn't sure if he wanted this to be his 10th film. So
It's like
to do,
nine and one quarters instead.
right. Well, it's based, I guess, in a way, he sees it kind of like the movie Four Rooms, which that one was kind of different in that it was an anthology with four different, I guess, storylines, each directed by a different person. Now, the format isn't quite like that here, but I think that's kind of his loophole for getting around calling this his 10th film, where he wrote and directed everything, if that makes sense. And I also think, Tarantino, when he talked on a podcast like several years ago about like if he would ever make a Star Wars movie, and he talked about how he'd rather make a Star Trek movie, and how he likes the episode, I think it's Yesterday's Enterprise. He sounded like he knew his stuff, but then like years later on some other podcasts, he sounded confused about the Kelvin timeline being a separate timeline and really wanted it to be a prequel to the original stuff. So I feel like they kind of needed someone to, rein him in and make sure he's working within the confines of how this timeline stuff is supposed to work. I think they did a decent job with that. These other directors, they've each had at least one Marvel thing to their credits. I think we mentioned Jessica Jones for Clarkson. Matt Shackman did WandaVision, and I think is also doing the Fantastic Four movie. And Noah Hawley, I mean, he did Legion. I mean, a few years ago, we talked about how in this universe you were almost on that show, and apparently the Zack of the other universe was almost on The Gifted. So go figure.
Oh wow. But yeah, he Shackman was the director of all 9 episodes of WandaVision. So
Yeah.
he was pretty much the primary on that. I'm trying to see. He was apparently the director of 2 episodes of Game of Thrones, and I'm trying to figure out what 2 episodes that he directed, because that's actually really cool. Let me see. The Spoils of War and Eastwatch. Both of those are really good episodes. Hot damn. The Spoils of War, I believe. Dang. Okay, so I think those are both season 7 episodes. That's fantastic. Hey, I'm a bigger fan of Shackman now. That's pretty damn cool, actually. Those are 2 really good episodes. So yeah, I think for continuity's sake, you do need somebody to rein in Tarantino, and I think to be able to tell something from an expansive universe, you need somebody with experience in an expansive universe, and it sounds like Clarkson and Shackman both have experience in Game of Thrones, and Marvel. So I think that just furthers my point that having an ensemble like this creates versatility and opportunity, and I think those are two words that I would use to describe this film.
Yeah, or Star Trek in general, versatility and yeah. So
Exactly.
it really fits, yeah.
Exactly.
Um, Also, side note, I always thought it was kind of a missed opportunity to call the Star Trek expanded universe stuff the Trek expanded universe. Um, but
You
um,
know, though, you know that so many people would mispronounce it and think you were talking about an expanded universe for an ogre in a swamp.
yeah, Shrek expanded
The
universe.
Shrek expanded universe, exactly.
Yeah,
You know that's going to happen.
yeah. I've also heard people pronounce it, or not pronounce it, but call the most of the books the Pocket universe because they were put out by Pocket Books, which I also quite like as a name.
Oh, that's clever.
Yeah.
That's clever. It's almost like it's taking place in like Professor Moriarty's tiny universe or something.
Yeah, I thought you were gonna say Moriarty's pocket, but yeah.
Well, I mean, that would be kind of interesting if he had like he lived inside of a pocket universe and then he had like his own little pocket universe that he carried around in his pocket. That's some Rick and Morty stuff right there.
Yeah. Also, like, side note for Picard, I was kind of surprised that Moriarty didn't play as big of a role as the trailer made me think he would. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, so that was like a little bit of a negative for me, but I was still mostly happy with the story that was told overall.
I feel like the final season of Picard was like just a big series of cameos so that they could give everybody a send off rather than just Patrick Stewart. And so to have him in it at all was nice. It was impressive that they found a way to work him in, but for those that are big fans of his character, I can definitely see why there'd be some disappointment attached to that.
Yeah, I mean, if he had not been in the trailer, it would have been, I think it would have played off better because
It was
there's
a
a
nice
press.
surprise instead of an anticipation.
Yeah, because there's a
Yeah.
precedent for season two's marketing focusing on Q, and he's the overarching villain basically for season
Right.
two.
Yeah.
So that kind of set my expectations, but overall, for the most part, I was happy. Um, but getting to Star Trek Forward, first of all, what do you think of that title for this fourth Kelvin movie?
I mean, I think it's appropriate because they're trying to literally move the story forward. It's probably a little too on the nose. My thing has always been if I feel like I can write something better than what was written and presented in front of me, then I feel like it was a waste of money. I don't necessarily feel like the story itself was a waste of my time and money, but I feel like I probably could have come up with that title and gotten paid for it. And so, yes, it's fitting, but it's also kind of obvious and on the nose.
Yeah, it's not very innovative, I guess you could say, but I do kind of like how if you think of 10 forward, you almost think of like 10 plus 4, and that's 14. And this is the 14th Star Trek film, you know?
Oh, that's you really think that went into the decision-making process for the naming of this film?
Maybe.
I feel like that's only something a Trekkie would think of and then
Yeah,
would say
probably.
it. And then Tarantino would be like, "Oh, that's convenient. Yes, we'll go with that." Uh-huh. That's exactly what I was thinking.
Yeah, like maybe I could have come up with that. I don't know about these writers and directors. Maybe it was just a coincidence.
It I feel like in all likelihood it probably was because I think when they're talking about forward, they're trying to figure out how to move the characters forward. They're trying to figure out how to move the story forward. They're trying to figure out how to, tell something else and tell it differently than it's been told before. And I think by making it an R-rated film, they definitely did that. With Discovery, the precedent has already been set for a little bit more mature themes and mature content, and so to be able to, I wouldn't say necessarily take that ball and run with it, but to follow that precedent and tell a story that is very different from the previous three films was a bold move. But as somebody who has kind of grown up with Star Trek, it's nice to see a grown up version of Star Trek on the big screen.
Yeah, like some people kind of forget that uh Data saying the S bomb in Star Trek Generations. So like it's not like the F bomb was like too much of a stretch. It's just like a couple decades later. And I feel like the way that it dropped in Discovery was actually pretty funny and it worked. Like, and I think there is a place for that type of language depending on the situations in Star Trek. Like, I don't think it's like, oh, if you use this language, you're ruining the property. Like, no. What? And like, I think Star Wars Andor almost used an F bomb, and maybe in the speech that they were thinking of using that, it might not have fit. But I think the line of dialogue they were thinking of using could have worked in a different context. Like if someone was just fighting stormtroopers and then that person was just like F the Empire, like I think that could have worked.
Well, you take the F bomb that gets used in this film. It happens a couple of times, but the one that stands out to me is in I guess it's like a hospital. It's kind of a makeshift type of place. It's almost like a triage. Reminded me very much of the TV show MASH, where you're assessing the needs, or maybe that DS9 episode where Bashir and Jake are on the front lines of the Dominion War. It was something that kind of reminded me like that. And in those types of stressful situations with explosions going on around you, and you've got blood spurting every which way, and everybody's all freaked out and frazzled and low on sleep and high on adrenaline, it stands to reason that if you poke a blood vessel and blood spurts up into your face like it did for that nurse, then yeah, naturally you're going to say the F word. That's just one of the things that is going to happen. And I don't think that it's a bit of a stretch to use the F word in Star Trek. I know that that's been debated about how language evolves over centuries and slang drops off and picks up, but the F word has been in our vernacular for at least 60 years, and it's kind of not really changed in all that time. So for that to even be a quote unquote outdated expletive in Star Trek terms, I think it's still appropriate in the context in which it was presented.
Yeah, I think a certain sect of Star Trek fans would lose their minds if Gene Roddenberry came back to life and he was like, "Oh yeah, I always intended to use the F bomb, but they wouldn't let me."
Hmm. Yeah, I feel like he definitely would. I think he was he around when Generations came out, or had he already passed?
He might have passed away, but actually, let me look this up. The Gene, yeah, because I always forget the year that he.
I knew
Uh,
that he
okay, he
was.
passed away in '91.
I believe that was before Generations then.
Yeah.
So my point being, I think he would have been proud of hearing Data say the S word. I think he would have cheered at something like that. And
Yeah.
so for this to be just a common part of the vernacular, and for the gore to kind of be increased a little bit, having a lot of, blood and bones exposed and stuff like that, that's very, very Tarantino. If you look at movies like Inglourious Bastards and Django and things like that, like there's definitely a lot more blood. There's definitely a lot more intensity. And in a sequence like that, you definitely can see his philosophy and his approach being incorporated into the Star Trek universe.
Yeah, and I also just realized that you can't spell next generation or generations without Gene. So I kind of wonder if maybe he was like being sneaky with that.
The
But
next generation, that sounds like a Bob's Burgers episode.
yeah. Throwback to when we did that Bob's Burgers the movie episode.
Oh man, I love that movie. I'm just gonna put that out there. But
Yeah. Yeah, coldest take I've ever heard. It just opinion everyone has.
Uh,
Um,
okay. My wife didn't care for it, but I don't think she cares for the show in general. So
oh, okay. Well, too late. But anyway.
yeah.
Um, so speaking of Bones getting exposed, Bones himself, Leonard McCoy,
Mm-hmm.
not to be confused with Leonard Nimoy. Um,
Confused us?
right. But yeah, Bones is feeling a lot of stress being at this hospital on this swamp world where the crew is trying to like help out while there's this like outbreak that's happening, and Bones is like seriously considering retiring, and he's thinking of his wife and daughter, and um like we've never gotten like this much focus on Bones, uh at least not in the other Calvin movies. Like they really spotlighted him here and like what's going through his head.
I mean, it's about time. That's all I've got to say. There are so many films out there that show what a fantastic action actor Carl Urban is. And for him to finally be in the spotlight and not just be a badass doctor, which he plays that part so well, but to have flashbacks and have moments where he can actually take a step back and flesh out his character a bit. That's not even something that DeForest Kelly got to do all that much when he was the original McCoy. So to expand on this character with this much time and this much depth, this much attention, the doing Spock character development is old hat. And to do something like this was a bold move, but I think it was the right move. We've had so much Kirk, we've had so much Uhura, we've had so much Spock. To be able to do something, I mean, even Scotty had a lot of development in Beyond. So to give Bones his due was very appropriate. And to incorporate those flashbacks in the middle of this triage, in the middle of this really, really tough situation, it kind of amplifies what things would I be thinking about if I was in his place? You know, I'm sitting there going, am I going to be thinking about my wife? Am I going to be thinking about my family? Am I going to be thinking about being on a different planet where I'm not stuck in this swamp, fixing flesh wounds? Like, what what is my priority going to be? And that type of commentary was able to show in Bones's character without having to say it outright. And I thought that was very clever and very well done.
Yeah, like the nightmares he has like are
Mm,
made to be really surreal looking. Like you can tell that Noah Hawley directed this nightmare sequence where there are all the important people in his life and they're getting all stretched out and the lighting is very frenetic. It's just horrifyingly beautiful to look at, which is the thing. Um, Also, another bold choice that this movie makes is it is set at a time when they are finally approaching the end of the 5-year mission, which
hmm
we never got to see explicitly on screen. There are multiple tellings of how it happens in comics and in books. I think even one of the books suggested that uh, a 5-year mission ended and then another one began, I guess to account for how there's like a ton of stories set in the TOS era and they need wiggle room. But yeah, like they're approaching the end of the 5-year mission. You even see live action versions of Eric's, the 3-armed alien, and Mares, the feline looking one, both from the animated series.
Is that what they were? Okay, so truth be told, I'm not super familiar with stuff from the animated series, and so there were some things in that confused me because I saw like somebody else in the theater kind of gasp when those characters showed up, and I was like, what is
Yeah.
like what context am I missing? So that clarifies a lot of things. Thank you. I appreciate that. But I do really like the idea of a 5-year mission being complete because it's almost like an enlistment period in the military. Your 2 years are up, your 3 years are up. What are you going to do now? Do you re-up for another enlistment for another mission, or do you consider reassignment? Do you want to remain the captain of the Enterprise, or do you want to, get a cushy job in San Francisco and settle down? Like, there's a lot that is weighing on people to figure out what the next move in their career is going to be. And so the balance of that is really tough. And I do think that they probably should have honed in on maybe like 2 or 3 people at the most, as far as those really tough moments of introspection and trying to figure out what to do with their careers. The fact that they basically did it for almost every member of the bridge crew was something that I felt like dragged the story along a little bit too much. I want people to have representation. I want people to have character development. I don't want it to happen at the expense of the pacing of the programming. And I feel like it did happen a little bit at some points where like we've got action, action, action. Oh, what's Sulu gonna do? Moment, moment, moment. Oh, what's Uhura gonna do? Like they would almost stop and pause whatever the moment was, or whatever the event was, or whatever was happening. It's almost like a sidebar that just sometimes felt a little forced. And so I think they had the right idea. I'm just not sure if the execution was how I would have done it. And maybe that's a product of having all those different directors.
Yeah, I kind of see what you mean. Like they do focus on the crew individually a lot when they have those introspective moments. Like you even have Jayla from Star Trek Beyond. Like she sees these last couple years with the crew as the most exciting time of her life, and now she's like, "What am I gonna do now?" type
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
But while I do appreciate the exploration of the characters, I can kind of see how this might have worked better for a TV show than for a
Yes.
feature film where the runtime's
Yes.
more limited.
Yes. Completely agree. Because it's just under 3 hours. And I feel like they probably could have done it in like 220 if they hadn't done all of those different sidebars. And so I think pacing wise, there were a couple of issues where maybe it's good to have 1 or 2 lines from Jayla where you're thinking about what's going to happen to her next, um, but we didn't need like a whole scene. You know what I mean? Or they'll have a scene where like 3 or 4 members of the bridge crew are having dinner together or having drinks together, and they're all batting around their different career possibilities off of each other for what feels like 10 minutes. And I'm like, let's do something else. Let's talk about something else. And we never do. And so I think you're right. I think if there had been like a whole season where like one episode we're focusing on what Uhura's career choices might be. We have an episode about what Scotty's career choices might be after these 5 years, et cetera, et cetera. Then maybe we can account for that type of pacing. But I don't know, for a feature film that's like 245, 250, something like that, I think it's probably 20 or 30 minutes too much.
Yeah, because I think it's nearly an hour before we get the event that pretty much kicks things into high gear, and that's the return of Chris Hemsworth to this series. Well, before we get to that, what'd you think of how they honored Anton Yelchin with this one? Like how they handled that whole thing with Chekhov?
You know, I've been back and forth on this because some people have really, really loved it, and then there are some people that have really, really not loved it. I I think it's appropriate that you would have like a way to address it right off the bat. And that way you can kind of see people mourning and see how it factors into their decision making. You lose a member of your crew while on this 5-year mission. You lose a critical member of your crew, and now everybody is thinking, what if I'm next? Like, from that point of view, I get it. And I appreciate that they give you, there's a crisis, but you don't see him actually die, but everybody knows that's what happened. So you have like Bones and Chekhov and, a red shirt on some sort of away mission. Bones doesn't like using transporters, so of course, you're going to be trying to make your way back up to the ship on a shuttle, and you sustain heavy damage and have to do an emergency transport before the shuttle blows, and Bones is the only one who makes it back. You don't see Anton Yelchin, but you see what his character's fate is. And so to have that be the thing that kind of helps set the tone for what everybody else's decision making is going to be for the rest of the movie, I think was really good. I think it was really well done. But I can also see the other side of the argument that would say, let's just have him get reassigned. Let's keep him alive in this universe. He'll just be serving on another vessel and won't make an appearance. I think this honors Anton a bit more by acknowledging his lack of presence on this Earth means that there's going to be a lack of his presence in the Star Trek world as well. So I'm in the camp that it was a good idea to kill off his character, and I felt that they did it respectfully.
Yeah, I'm still kind of mixed on it because I was fully expecting them to reassign him.
Mm-hmm.
But, the way that they do it, he gets killed off during this disastrous event on the away team's mission. And, we don't see his face, but the hairstyle and it's pretty much meant to be him. But I don't know. I guess on one hand, it's been 7 years, so a lot of time has passed. I think if they had done this, even just 2 or even 3 years after, it would have felt like a bit much and maybe too soon. But maybe this longer gap sort of helped soften it in a way. And there is something later on that I guess also softens the blow. But in the meantime, I do kind of appreciate how, it's a catalyst for the crew thinking about where do they go from here? They've had people die on away missions,
Sure.
I feel kind of bad saying this, the nobodies, the ones that we're not as familiar with, but
sure,
when it's someone familiar like Chekhov and he's so young, they're like, man, should we still be doing this? And they're all reassessing their career choices. So I can sort of get the decision making. It's just still something I'm still getting used to, even after all this time since seeing the movie.
Yeah, I get that, and like I said, that there would definitely going to be a couple of camps, because you could have definitely written it in such a way where he was just on the rise. He was an up and coming officer. He got offered a commission somewhere else, and now we've got this other ensign who is, he's not Chekhov, and maybe they call him by the wrong name or something, and the ensign feels bad and they feel bad for calling him the wrong name or something like that. But I think to drive the character's stories forward, you need to have something that really makes them reconsider why they joined Starfleet. And I think the loss of a friend, the loss of a bridge crew member does that for them. So I feel like that was justifiable.
Yeah, and I will say that I am glad that they didn't go the deep fake route. I feel like that would have been a cheap move, and I appreciate that Star Trek has been bold enough to recast characters, even classic characters. This Kelvin series was a recast, and they did it again with Strange New Worlds. as well. And well, I guess Spock and Pike appeared in Discovery before then, but like Star Trek trusts its audience to know that these are the characters, even if the actors are different. Now, of course, there are some fans who will refuse and say, "Oh, it's an alternate timeline," even if like the Paramount Plus stuff is still in the Prime timeline. But I appreciate that they're able to recast while still honoring the characters. Now, recasting Chekhov for this, I don't think would have been the right move. Like I said, like I was expecting like reassignment, but the way that they did it here, like all things considered, I'm glad that they didn't use deepfake personally.
No, I can agree to that. I think I think you need to honor Yelchin for the contributions that he made, and I just don't feel like deepfake would have done that. So I'm definitely with you there.
Right. And like we do see a picture of him during the funeral, which, you know, well, at least we see his face in that way. Um, and there's like a nice eulogy and whatnot.
You know what
Uh,
I appreciated was the fact that they gave him a credit.
Yeah, for sure.
Like technically you didn't have his body in the movie, obviously, but he's a character. He's a part of this crew. He's a part of this franchise. He was a part of this movie, even if it was just a picture, if it was just a hollow that made an appearance. You still give credit to Yelchin as an actor for his contribution to the franchise and to the series. And so to partially dedicate this movie to him and to give him an credit, um, I haven't heard anything, but I feel like the movie residual or something like that, um, or even his whatever contribution they would have made probably went to his family, which was a really good thing too. Like they didn't just use his face or his likeness arbitrarily. I feel like there had to have been some sort of compensation involved. And so like for them to go to that much depth and that much effort, I think really shows how much he meant to this franchise.
And, you know, I love Walter Koenig. I love the guy. He was good as Chekhov in the original series and movies, but I really think Anton Yelchin elevated that character. No, like I still love Walter Koenig, but I think Koenig, I love him more in his Babylon 5 villain role, Alfred Bester, than I do as him as Chekhov. So Yelchin's Chekhov, I think, is you could say is my Chekhov if I were to, you know, compare them side by side, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I think that's one thing that this franchise has allowed for, and Strange New Worlds has done it as well to a certain extent, is just providing opportunities to manufacture new stories, to create new ways of exploring a character that maybe the previous iteration wasn't able to do. And so I like the new Pike in Strange New Worlds, and I definitely enjoyed Chekhov and even Uhura. Like there's so many things that are new, and it's not a discredit or a disservice necessarily to
Right.
any previous iterations. It's just an opportunity to see what else can be explored, and they do it with some really fantastic actors and actresses.
Exactly. So the main thing that happens, you know, the big change is Chris Hemsworth is back as George Kirk, you know, James Kirk's father. How do you feel about the way that they brought Chris Hemsworth into this and how Kirk and crew react to this with all their suspicions and whatnot?
I'll tell you, it's a really tough balance because in my opinion, this is just me. I'm probably not speaking for all Trekkies. I feel like it dishonors his sacrifice in the first movie's prologue. I know that he's like hopping from another universe. It's not the same exact George Kirk, but to have Chris Hemsworth reappear, it cheapens that first movie's prologue for me. It doesn't leave that lasting impact. It doesn't make the same difference. And so, after he appeared, like I saw rumors and I saw like possible spoilers before I went and saw the movie. Like I knew that it was a very distinct possibility, but to actually see him kind of frustrated me a little bit because I was like, you're so busy being Thor and being in extraction movies and stuff. Like,
Yeah, and Furiosa. Yeah.
right. And so, like, it felt forced. It felt like you needed one more title, big brand name actor to,
One more Chris.
one more Chris to help market the film and whatnot, and kind of have like a surprise reason for his return and whatever. I just I it feels very Hollywood to me. And I didn't want, this is going to sound terrible, but I didn't want my new Star Trek to feel as Hollywood as that felt. So that was one issue that I did have with this film, and how integral it was to pretty much everything else.
Yeah, I feel like pretty much every Trekkie saw this coming, that this was going to be a Kelvin variation of a mirror universe.
Yep.
So to not only bring back George Kirk, but have him be like a more evil version, like it does sort of cheapen that prologue in a way. I can totally see what you're saying. Like it is an interesting dynamic. Jim really wants to see his dad again, but he knows that this person isn't really his dad. And so he has all this emotional turmoil going on inside of him now. And you also touch on like it feeling more Hollywood. I think another fear that people had going into this was that, even though Star Trek was sort of, well, very much ahead of the curve with multiverse stuff, at least on the screen. With comics, it might be a different story, but on the screen, they were ahead on the multiverse game. But bringing this out now with this multiverse storyline, while all these other multiverse movies are happening, I can see how like some people might feel fatigued about it.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. The I think the fatigue set in with Multiverse of Madness and just kept getting worse.
Yeah.
So yeah, the mirror universes have been a part of Star Trek since the 60s. I'm not discrediting that as a plot point. I just feel like there were a lot of different ways that you could have incorporated that, and none of them had to involve Chris Hemsworth. That's my bottom line. You could have had an alternate Kirk, with split screen technology with two Chris Pines. You could have had, just about any other different way that you could have wanted to go. You could have even found a way to cross it over and, have freaking Bill Shatner make an appearance. Like there were so many other things you could have done, but you went the Chris Hemsworth route, and now we all have to live with it.
Right. Yeah, and you mentioned the like alternate Kirk thing. There's a thing that happens in this movie where from far away you see what appears to be Jim Kirk, but with a mustache. And at first, some people were thinking, "Oh, is this a mirror universe version of him?" But no, it was his older brother, Sam Kirk. Still from the Kelvin timeline, but here, like as he gets closer to the camera, he's played by Chris Evans. So they
Man.
were really desperate getting more Chris's into this.
Oh, so many Chris's, so many, like we need to like get a cross section and yell bingo, or we need to like just get a bell and ring it every time we see a Chris's face on screen or something. Like it's so many, Chris. Did you ever see the video on YouTube? I forget who made it. Too Many Cooks.
Oh yeah, I remember watching that in college.
Oh my God.
Too
I'm
many cooks.
too many cooks.
Such a surreal video.
Too many Chris. Too many Chris.
Yeah, this truly is Chris's on Infinite Earths.
Oh, I see what you did there. Oh man, that's really meta. I'm gonna have to sit and think about that one for a second.
Yeah, but basically Sam Kirk is here to like give his little brother some support as they both face this alternate version of their father that they never really got to know. And on that level, I do kind of appreciate the brotherly bond. It's just kind of distracting though, because it's another famous Chris. Like, I almost would have preferred if they did get Chris Pine and just put a mustache on him. Echo how William Shatner was basically playing his brother, but dead and with a mustache in that one TOS episode.
Well, didn't Leonard Nimoy put on a mustache to be the mirror Spock or something like that at one point?
Yeah, or like a goatee. Yeah.
Yeah, a goatee. Yeah, yeah. So like that that was definitely within the realm of possibility. Again, you could have gotten a piece of makeup that went over somebody's upper lip instead of hiring Chris Hemsworth. But what did you do? You hired Chris Hemsworth. Oh, sorry. I didn't think I would be that fired up over it, but apparently I am.
George Kirk, Chris Hemsworth is trying to wreak havoc, take over the Enterprise. And weirdly, we also see that Harry Mudd has stowed away on the Enterprise. And he's played by Nick Frost here, Simon Pegg's buddy. What'd you think of his take on Harry Mudd compared to Rainn Wilson and the original actor?
I can't even remember the original actor's Harry Mudd for the life of me. But I've always seen Harry Mudd. I've always interpreted him to be almost like the Hondo Onaka of Star Trek, if you will. Like he's a ne'er-do-well, yes, but he's also just kind of a wild card, and he's also just kind of randomly popping up. For him to be as big of a part of the story as he ended up being was probably a bit much, but this also felt very much like they were trying to return to their roots. They were trying to go back to what made the original Star Trek so successful and what made it so iconic and popular. You've already done Khan. You've already done the story of enlisting in Starfleet. Like what else can you do to kind of move the story, quote unquote, forward? If you'll pardon the pun. And
Yeah.
I didn't think Harry Mudd was like the focal point. I never saw him as the fulcrum, but to see him as like the intermediary for the Romulans, that was pretty cool. And it stands to reason that a George Kirk who hails from a mirror universe where there is an empire, it stands to reason that he would be trying to make contact with whatever the closest thing that resembles a civilized empire would be in this world. We have explored the Klingons in this timeline. We have explored, kind of outcast Romulans who were on like an oil tanker of a ship that were seeking revenge. But to have like the civilized cloaking device Romulan star empire find themselves allied with an empirical based George Kirk, that was an interesting storyline because I've always been fascinated with like the Tal Shiar. I've always been fascinated with just the contrast between Romulans and Vulcans, and so having the two of them link up through an intermediary like Harry Mudd, it eventually makes sense, but it takes a while to get there.
Yeah, like for something with forward in the title, they do spend a bit of time trying to go back to their roots, maybe a bit too much. But with this alliance, there's some interesting stuff that goes on. And there's a point where some of the crew of the Enterprise gets stranded on this alien planet that looks like 1920s Earth, but with like aliens. So again, another throwback to the original series in a way.
Yep.
But with the like 1920s gangster culture here, this is another opportunity for Tarantino to flex his style. And
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, this was definitely a Tarantino directed sequence for sure. It's interesting to look at the possibility of like the different costumes, but also how to incorporate prosthetics into it, because you need to make everybody look like a 20s gangster, but you also need to know who the bad guys are. And so to have like just the tiniest pointy ears. You know what I mean?
yeah.
Like it's not those obvious over the top look like Christmas elves type of pointy ears. It's like it's more curved with just a tiny inflection. You really have to be watching to notice their appearance and when they appear. It actually took a second viewing for me to recognize that they were basically there from the time the landing party arrived and were kind of almost guiding them towards the saloon so that they could be ambushed. So the depth that Tarantino goes to with this sequence is actually pretty impressive, but it's definitely not something that you notice on first watch. And I kind of like that about a Star Trek film. Like it has some depth, it has some gore, it has some elements that you really didn't have in the previous films, and that is a part of what helps it move forward, I think, is just how different the storytelling model is from everything else, and yet at the same time still feels like classic Trek. I think that's how they strike the balance, is they are telling the story in a different way from the other three films, but they are also telling a story that is familiar. So it's like different and yet also kind of the same.
Yeah, and something that has also been brought up earlier in the movie, like Jim Kirk is reflecting on how they lost Carol Marcus a couple years prior. Her absence and beyond was never really explained, and we come to find out that she got lost in space because of some anomaly, and they presumed that she was dead. But apparently, like, it was a wormhole that brought her to this planet here, this gangster type setting. So, like, what'd you think of their reunion with her in this?
Well, again, I think it harkens back to character decision making, and Kirk like has a decision to make regarding his career and what he wants to do with his life moving forward. I think he probably, much like Bill Shatner's Kirk, saw an opportunity for a future with her, and then that opportunity was lost. And so my interpretation was, Pine's Kirk is looking at this going, am I really going to miss out on another chance to be with this woman? Am I really going to stay the captain of the Enterprise, and it means missing out on reuniting with this woman more fully and being there for her as we try to negotiate bringing her back home. There's definitely a lot of character depth that goes on in their reunion, and a lot of subtext that goes on. But I was also just kind of surprised to see her back, because I didn't really miss her in Beyond. I'm sorry, I didn't, but I guess
I mean, I missed her, but mainly because I like Alice Eve.
yeah, that's very fair. I personally didn't miss her, but I like yourself, there are probably other people who did miss her, and so it didn't necessarily feel forced to bring her back. But I'm also looking at this going, I feel like Kirk has enough weighing on his shoulders that you didn't need to necessarily like have to throw a love interest his way, and yet you did. So like I get it, but I also don't get it. Kind of on the fence, but it's good for his character development, so I'm not gonna like complain about it.
Yeah, and he does think about how, he lost his father, who was, it was a heroic sacrifice, but it was like while he was in that service of Starfleet. And so, like, Jim is thinking about that and how if he ever has children with someone, he wants to be there for the children. I mean, we know the tragic fate that befalls his son in the Prime timeline. So, this was kind of interesting because it's like, could things turn out differently? Like, what's going to happen here,
Well, but I think that's the other thing too that I'm not certain about is he's already struggling with like trying to connect with this person who's not his dad, but also like trying to stop him from, destroying Starfleet. And then on the other end of the spectrum, he is trying to deal with like his own personal struggles. Like, does he feel responsible for the fate of the universe because he needs to stop this person who looks like his dad? Or is he responsible to himself and starting relationships and forging a path that gives him the opportunity to live his life rather than living a life of Starfleet? There's a lot going on with Kirk that it's happening on two or three different fronts. He's thinking about, family, he's thinking about career, he's also thinking about his dad or, his non-dad. Chris Pine really had to flex the acting muscles a little bit to be able to keep up with all of these different storylines.
Yeah, like there's so much going on that I kind of do get why they made it almost 3 hours, but again, like some of the self-reflecting moments earlier in the movie could have been trimmed down a bit. Like I feel like in some instances there's more telling than showing, like
Yes.
there needs to be a balance with that sort of thing.
Yes, I would agree to that. I think there's a lot more talking about your situation rather than living it out. And I guess in some cases that's true to life because people do a lot of talking. But I wasn't really expecting this to like have a mini episode of Cheers where everybody's just talking about life at the bar.
Yeah, I mean, Morn, you probably already know this. On Deep Space Nine,
Yep,
Morn is like his name is an anagram of Norm from
of Norm
Cheers.
from Cheers. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. You're talking to a deep dive Trekkie who's also watched a lot of old TV shows. So that is one trivia I'm quite familiar with.
Yeah. Um, so what do you think of the way that this all comes to a climax? Like, did it work for you, or was it like what was your reaction?
At the end of the day, I think it does work for me. As much as I dislike the notion of Chris Hemsworth being the quote unquote antagonist, um, I love a good space battle. I love a good space battle. And this one not only had like really well thought out and really well choreographed space fight scenes, but it incorporated landing parties. It incorporated using ground troops. And it really gave you an idea for why the neutral zone was established in the first place. And that's something that I've always been curious about is, the violation of the neutral zones and why it's been so sacred, even in the TOS series. Like, what is it about the war that made people want to honor the neutral zone on both sides? What was so tragic about it? And at the end of the day, humans and Romulans in this point in time do not like each other. Like there is almost some racist, like racial subtext about humans hating Romulans and vice versa. The emotions are still very raw, apparently, from the establishment of this neutral zone, where, current soldiers are trying to avenge the loss of their fathers or their cousins or their uncles, what have you, and it's still very personal and you can feel that in the way that the shots are being fired, the way that they kind of hone in on some of the torpedo specialists and some of the targeting analysts, like they are as precise and pristine as they can be because they have motive. They have a reason to be that precise. They have a reason to be that angry at humans or vice versa. And so to have this type of fight be rooted almost in racism was very, very compelling and very different from what we had seen when it comes to Romulans versus humans. So I did like that. I liked that Hemsworth met his demise, but I think I really, really like the approach that they took to humans versus Romulans and why this neutral zone is so important.
Yeah, and I know that there were a few fans here and there who are like, "Oh, they went too political with this one," and I'm just like, "Shut up! This is how Trek has always been."
Star Trek's always been political. It's never not been.
Yeah, like even the demise of evil George Kirk, it still brings a tear to Chris Pine, Jim Kirk's eyes, and Sam Kirk as well, because even though this isn't their father, they're still sad that, like, well, basically the fact that they met this version of their father, and it's like seeing their own father or someone who looks like him die before their eyes. So they're definitely going to need a lot of therapy after all this.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, you need a ship's counselor. This is where they kind of spark the idea of
Yeah.
of having a counselor aboard the Enterprise, and then like you know that that's like a subtle nod to Counselor Troy in the Next Generation. It's like, oh, that's why we have a ship's counselor, because people suffer a ton of PTSD and other trauma from the lives that they live in service to Starfleet. And I think there's no better poster boy for that than Jim Kirk. And so to just exacerbate that further, to drive that point home even more, um, was no surprise. But again, the acting chops of Chris Pine, he did it so well, where he basically knew what had to be done and hated himself doing it. He hated doing it the whole time, but he still made sure that that Starfleet was safe, that the neutral zone was preserved. Like, he had to do all of these things, but it came at the expense of the guy who looked like his father. So that is some great, almost Game of Thrones level storytelling. So I definitely saw elements of Clarkson and Shackman in that sequence for sure.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, we get the demise of George Kirk, and there's a bit of everyone just coming to grips with what's just happened and sort of doing the cleanup, the aftermath of it all. And they're sort of reflecting on how this truly is the end of the 5-year mission. And it's kind of open-ended, like what each of them is going to decide once they get back home. But this next bit that happens, I'm still kind of on the fence about it, but basically there's a Q that shows up, and this is the child of Q and Lady Q from Voyager. And he basically shows them what some of the like prime timeline versions of some of them end up doing, like basically showing them like a vision of what happens. And it kind of comforts them to see an older version of Chekhov who was able to live a full life. And we even get a glimpse of Nichelle Nichols as like a little tribute to her, since she passed away last year. So on one hand, I thought it was a touching tribute, but on the other hand, I can see how it might feel forced, like putting it in this movie, especially like at the end of everything.
Yeah, because when you do something like that, it almost feels like you're wrapping things up. It almost feels like you are saying we're done. And I was really, really hoping that they wouldn't be done. The tonality of this, the cinematography of this, the directing, the direction that it took. I was really, really hoping that the ending would kind of give us this open-ended perspective of, what these characters might want to do. But by bringing in a Q, you throw in something that's different from their timeline. Like, I don't think there's any record of a Q interacting with Kirk or anybody else. And so,
Well,
like,
just in like maybe the Kelvin timeline comics, but the canonicity of that is debatable, I guess you could say.
it's dubious at best just because of what kind of fans they're appealing to. And
Right.
and so I just I'm with you. It was a touching tribute, and I definitely heard a couple of awes in the theater, but I just didn't know if that was how I personally would have wrapped up the film, because it makes you feel like there isn't going to be a fifth. And so, like, what are they going to do to, I wouldn't call it backpedal necessarily, but how do you come away from that? And if you end up making a fifth, how do you like take that as the final piece of the last movie and use it to help tell the next story? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and what also makes it kind of awkward as well is they show Chris Pike, who is able to live a bit longer, and so we see Strange New Worlds Pike in this vision, and it basically, even if it was intended to be heartwarming, it felt like an ad to me. Now, don't get me wrong, I ended up watching Strange New Worlds season 2 and have been really loving it, but I don't know, like the cynic in me was still kind of like that. That's just an ad right there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I mean, there have been plenty of times where Star Trek is almost self-referential, and that's part of the game. That's part of what Star Trek is and what it does. But when you've got creatives like Quentin Tarantino attached to the project, I guess I just thought it would have been a little more subtle.
Yeah. Well, I guess it's better that they put it at the end of the movie rather than forcing it somewhere in the middle. So I guess that's something.
I guess. I would have hoped that they would have landed the plane or landed the shuttle a little bit better. It does feel a little forced and it feels a little choppy. And honestly, it probably affects my rating a little bit. I really loved the fight sequence with the Romulans, and I thought that would have been a cool way to kind of, bring things to a close. But when you throw in that little, almost an epilogue at the end, it's like, okay, when do the credits actually roll? And then they roll. And so I probably do need to end up taking a little bit off for pacing and story selection when it comes to that sequence. But as a whole, I think this is a really solid film, and it does move the characters forward because it's the end of their 5-year mission. And so, it's appropriate that that's what this movie would be titled.
Yeah, and they even do they end it with a Final Frontier monologue and
Yeah.
modify it a little bit so that it mentions the end of the 5-year mission, but to go forward and boldly go where no one has gone before. So I still, whenever I hear any variation of that, I tend to still do a fist bump, and the music, we did even talk about the music, how it felt like coming home to this timeline with a do 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 do. But I feel like there are also some like new things, and maybe there is even some like newer type of score music than storytelling, you could argue. Um, and I do appreciate that there was no post credit scene to this, so in a way, it doesn't feel as Hollywood.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many Hollywood movies. I'm glad that some of the there that some films and some franchises are moving away from it, and I'm glad that this one was one of them. Um, I forgot. I straight up forgot to look. Was Giacchino the composer for this one as well, or did they get somebody else?
Yeah, it was him for this one. Yeah.
Yeah, Giacchino has always been able to strike a balance between what uh reminds you of a franchise and sounds like it, but also takes it in a different direction. I personally loved his composition for Rogue One. I thought he
Oh
did
yeah.
a fantastic job with Rogue One because it sounded like Star Wars, but it was new themes. And I think he does that exceptionally well with Star Trek as well. You hear elements and you hear pieces and instruments that are very, very reminiscent of TOS and TNG, and yet he finds a way to take those brass instruments and finds a way to incorporate other pieces of the orchestra around it that just makes it sound new and exciting, but at the same time, it still very much sounds like Star Trek. He strikes that balance so incredibly well.
Yeah, and I mean with Rogue One, just a side tangent, like yeah, there are those really suspenseful music moments that really feed into the battle, but there's also the slower moments. Like whenever I get to that part where Jin is doing her speech at the rebel base and trying to get everyone to unite and go to Scarif, like you hear the theme that goes do 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 do, and for whatever reason, like I almost tear up during that moment because it's a desperate attempt for Jin to get everyone to listen and to unite and fight against evil. And that piece of music is so subtle, but it just fits the moment so well. So, can't say enough good things about Giacchino.
Absolutely. He is up there with John Williams and Hans Zimmer as some of the greatest composers of our generation, I feel like.
Yeah, I agree. So, what's your final thoughts and score out of 10, a unit of measurement for that score for Star Trek Forward?
I hate to do um, a little bit of a shameless plug, but I'm also not super ashamed of it. I'm part of another podcast now over at Fandom Empire that's called Flixbusters, and we try to determine whether a film is a flick or a bust. And we have four different criteria that we use for measuring the point totals, and it's 25 possible points for each one. One of them is creativity, one is quality, one is sound, and then the other one is the enjoyment factor. So with creativity, it has to do with the story, the writing, the characters, character development, etc. I did like the depth that they went to with a lot of these characters, but like I said, I didn't care for how long it took to get there sometimes, and I also didn't really care for Chris Hemsworth being like the villain. So I probably give it like an 18 out of 25 for creativity. It's a very well-made film, though. The directing, the acting, the cinematography, so many of those types of components are really well made. So it's probably like a 22 out of 25 on that end. Sound, we were just talking about the music. That's probably like another 20 out of 25. I really liked Giacchino's score, but there were some other pieces of sound and sound design. I wish we'd had a little more boatswain's whistle. I wish we had had a little bit more of the clacking of boots in the hallway during battle sequences. Some little things like that that kind of pile up. And then the enjoyment factor, just out of a possible 25 points, how much did I enjoy this? I would probably say uh, probably in the 20 to 21 range. I'll give it a 21 because it's a fun film. So overall, it would probably, looking at it, 18, 22, 20, and 21. Yeah, that's pretty accurate to what I was thinking. I was thinking an 8 out of 10, but with that score, it would be an 81 out of 100. So I give it an 81%.
All right, and what's your unit of measurement, like an object related to the movie for that score?
I forgot that we do that. It's been so long since I've been on. Um, you know what? I will probably use. Oh man. Okay, so in um in the hospital, what do they use to I'm thinking of that triage hospital that Bones is in. Um he's injecting them with different cc's of different medications. It's a hypo spray, right? Is that what they call it?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
81 out of 100 triage hospital hypo sprays.
nice. Yeah, and I think I pretty much have the same score. I'm still doing it out of 10 because I don't have the bandwidth to do the out of 25 bit right now. But
That's fair.
But yeah, like I enjoyed this enough. I definitely still prefer the 2009 movie out of these four Kelvin movies. But I think I enjoyed this more than Into Darkness and Beyond. So I'm good. And again, like, the fan service moments are still it's still a debatable kind of a sore point. I do like though that in the end credits they dedicated to Anton Yelchin and to Nichelle Nichols, so that's nice. So I'm gonna give Star Trek Forward 8 out of 10 planets. The Star Trek planets.
Hey, it's a planet score.
Yeah, see what I did there?
That's what we do on IPC. Yeah, I see what you
Yeah.
did there. It's a great segue to remind people to tune into our monthly episodes of the IPC podcast whenever we end up publishing them. We're working on getting an episode put together, but I'm glad that I was able to pop in for this one. Thanks again for having me, man.
Yeah, it's always great to have you. And yeah, I'll include the links to IPC in the show notes. So that's on Podbean and Mixler and like some other platforms, and Fandom Empire is on YouTube. Feel free to add on to like what I just said in case I'm forgetting anything.
No, that's pretty much it. I also do a lot of sports broadcasting on my personal page. So if you're interested in hearing me talk a little bit faster and a little bit louder and a little bit about sports, then you can follow me on my personal socials at the username Zach the Voice. It's the same across all platforms: Facebook, uh, X, Twitter, whatever you call it, Instagram, Threads, TikTok. Same username on all those places. So yeah, just find at Zach the Voice to find out what's happening next.
Yeah, man, I still can't believe it's called X. That's like one of the stupidest things to ever happen.
It is. You would think that that would only happen in one universe, but apparently it's happening everywhere.
Yeah. But one thing I'm excited about is the Star Trek book club I'm part of. The next book we're going to talk about is Planet X, which is a Star Trek X-Men crossover. So
Oh,
that'll be fun to read.
that sounds fun. Have y'all ever read anything from the Typhon Pact series?
Um, I'm not sure if the book club has. I only joined them. Like it's an online book club. LA Away Team is the Facebook group.
Cool.
But I joined like 2 years ago, and since I've been in the book club, like it's a monthly thing, they haven't read any Typhon Pact, but on my own, I've been steadily making my way through the post Nemesis books. So that includes like the TNG stuff that's after Nemesis, the Voyager relaunch stuff,
Yep.
the Titan novels. So I'm not at Typhon Pact yet. I just read the Department of Temporal Investigations, the first book of that, if you can
Okay.
believe it. So like some of them are hit and miss. Like some are really good, some are middle of the road, some are not that enjoyable to me. But I'm steadily making my way to Typhon Pact. Like I think the Typhon Pact itself has happened in a couple of the stories I've read. I just haven't read that series title itself yet, but I'm getting there.
I read a couple of books a couple of years ago, and then life happened, and I stopped with my with my recreational reading, but I've got most of the series on paperback, and so if I ever do end up picking up a book again, it'll probably be one of those because it's a very interesting story with some very familiar characters, and it's not entirely implausible what kind of stories they're trying to tell. Some of them, like an X-Men crossover, can feel maybe a little far-fetched at times, but these feel very true to form, if that makes sense.
Yeah, like some of them do feel like they would happen after Nemesis. Some of it doesn't fit with the Paramount Plus stuff, but again, like Star Trek has multiple timelines and universes, so it still feels like authentic, like you said, you know?
Yep, very true. Very, very true.
Right. And oh, before we sign off, did you want to give like your overall thoughts on Strange New Worlds season 2 so far?
Yeah, I think the development of the characters is one of my favorite things about this show. Is you get to learn about characters like Chapel and Mbenga. You get to see some of the PTSD and how people handle it from the Klingon War, and I think the antics that they incorporate as well is what helps balance the show out so well. I have yet to see the musical episode, but I really, really enjoyed the episode that involved, I think it was a transporter malfunction, and um, Spock became 100% human instead of 50% human.
Yeah,
And
that was such a fun episode. I was
felt
like surprised I couldn't think of any previous instance that happened with Spock.
it was so interesting, and it was such a great exploration of his character, of his relationships with people, with how he would approach different Vulcan rituals from a human point of view. Just great, great storytelling, great comedy, very heartwarming. And that's a lot of those things that this show is capable of doing. And so, um, out of out of all the new Trek that we've been experiencing, I think I've been enjoying Strange New Worlds the most. It feels the most like classic Trek while also still feeling very modern and fun.
Yeah, and you mentioned the musical episode that still has yet to air as of when we're recording this, but I'm excited for it. You know, we've had singing in Star Trek before. You know, Vic Fontaine,
Or
Uhura herself sang in the original series, but a full-on musical episode. It's surprising we haven't really had one in Trek before. And I admit, last week I was kind of a little bit disappointed because I thought the musical episode would be last week, but then we got a really excellent story of like what Mabanga and Chapel witnessed during the war against the Klingons, and it was a great episode. So, like you said, they do a good job balancing the heavy stuff and the lighthearted stuff.
they really do. They really do. And I'm bummed it takes so long between seasons because those 10 weeks that we do get stuff, it's always fun to watch. So I'm gonna ride with it and roll with it and enjoy it for as long as we've got it. But I'm really they haven't announced a season 3, have they? Or did they before even season 2 launched?
Yeah, season 3 is confirmed. Although I think in that other universe where a strike is happening, it's gonna be a little bit delayed.
Yeah, that makes sense. Sucks for them, but I'm just glad that it's happening.
Yeah.
Because like I said, I know they're getting ready to wrap up Discovery. I feel like Strange New Worlds has the potential to go on for several seasons.
Yeah. I mean, with the older like the 90s well 80s 90s Trek shows, 7 seasons kind of became the standard, and then Enterprise got canceled prematurely. 5 seasons feels like in general, like to me, feels like a good end point to shoot for. You know, Babylon 5 did that well, Breaking Bad, Better Call Saul did go 6 seasons and they made it work, so I'll give it that. So I guess it's not too much of a stretch to go beyond 5 and still be good. But I think on average, I don't know, that's kind of the frame of mind I'm of. But if they can keep it good, then bring it on.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think it has a lot of potential for more seasons. I think they've got a lot of adventures still left to be told, a lot of character development still left to do. So I'm really hoping that it gets, I guess, at least 2 more seasons. I would love to see this be like the midway point where like we're only halfway into developing these characters. Just wait and see how much more we're gonna flesh it out. So that's selfishly what I'm hoping for, but in the meantime, I'm just gonna enjoy what we've got.
Yeah, for sure. Plenty of Trek to go around. So, yeah, thanks for joining me again. And I'll include my plugs in the edit like I normally do. And without further delay, have a good day. Okay, so that's the end of the discussion, but we still got some segments to cover. All right, so before getting into Strange New Worlds Season 2, I just want to mention the plugs again. So, Zach, of course, mentioned that he's on IPC, and I see that there's an episode out that he and his wife Edna did about Barbenheimer. So, hey, how's that for barbecue watch? And, again, happy early birthday to Zach. And also happy birthday to Jonathan Frakes. It's his birthday as this episode comes out. Jonathan Frakes played Will Riker on Star Trek. And for my plugs, I recently appeared on Mr. Multiverse's Requalizers podcast that he has on his Patreon. We talked about our ideas for another requel to the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Hey, Trexas Chainsaw Massacre. I wonder if there's something to that. And we're now around that time of the 50th anniversary of the in-universe date of when that takes place. So it was a fun half-hour discussion. Something I think I forgot to mention in the discussion was that Old Man Leatherface, like in our era, like doesn't really make sense to me if you're going for something realistic. But yeah, you can go to his Patreon and check out that discussion if you'd like. And I'm also going to be on my friend Jesse's podcast, Question Possible Answer, sometime soon. We had the idea to talk about Accepted, but we might also talk about some other things, like some DC related things from the sound of it. So subscribe to that podcast and keep an eye out for what we talk about. And also check out decorativevegetable.com and that whole network of podcasts. I still don't think the finale for Triple Play, that movie trilogy podcast, I still don't think the finale that I guessed it on is out yet, but still check out that website, decorativevegetable.com. There's a Doctor Who podcast, a classic sci-fi podcast, a Blake 7 podcast. So yeah, and the movie trilogy one I mentioned. So very great discussions on there, lots of fun. As for my plugs, StevenSchinder.com, at Steven Schinder on Instagram and Twitter, Steven Schinder Storytelling on Facebook, and I'm also at Steven Schinder on Threads, but it feels like not much is going on there, so. And again, both my novels, Lemons Like Rain, Trespassing Through Visages, are both part of the Standalones and Stepping Stones series. You can find them on Amazon. So, look in the show notes for all of these links. Also, check out Yes Shift, a podcast/vlog I do with my dad. We interviewed Royna Stolt from the Flower Kings, who was also on one of my favorite albums ever, the Anderson Stolt album, Invention of Knowledge, so that's cool. You can also email delayedreplaypodcast@gmail.com. Let us know your thoughts on Star franchises. So it looks like Zach really enjoyed the musical episode of Star Trek Strange New Worlds, and I did as well. Um, I'm going to read his thoughts in a moment, but first I want to read the overall thoughts on Strange New Worlds Season 2 from my friend Liana Ahmed, who, due to scheduling conflicts, couldn't be on this episode. And people who've listened to older episodes of Delayed Replay may remember back when I mentioned here and there a Star Trek podcast we used to do. And we don't do it anymore because, there's some stuff that came up in both of our lives and just a variety of factors. That happened in both universes. But we really enjoyed talking Star Trek. I have those episodes on a hard drive, so they exist there at least. They might still be on Facebook. I haven't really checked recently. But point is, Liana Ahmed, huge Star Trek fan, and this is what she had to say, general thoughts on Strange New Worlds Season 2, without any spoilers. These are her thoughts. Many times, the sophomore season of any Star Trek series tends to be a low point. The writers are still clinging to whatever they thought made the first season work so great, even if it's played out. Strange New Worlds learned the lesson. I was impressed overall with the amount of creative chances taken within this season. There are a few episodes I like less and consider to be subpar. However, this season will be forever remembered for many great things. We were introduced to Paul Wesley as the new face of James Kirk in Season 1. We really got to see him in action now. Season 2 gave us the unprecedented crossover with Lower Decks. Most importantly, Subspace Rhapsody, a Star Trek musical episode, exists now. The first episode of the series was the weakest. While we got to see some amazing action sequences, we also defied the laws of physics beyond science fiction comprehension with a Star Wars-esque, unprotected flight through space. While the second episode of the series follows in the footsteps of A Measure of a Man from TNG, it fell short. After watching these 2 episodes, I was concerned for the season. I now stand happily corrected because the rest of the season was amazing. I especially loved the season-ending cliffhanger. I am so happy we are no longer doing the bad guy of the season style episodes where there are little to no stakes and you know how it's going to end. We are going to the storytelling for which Star Trek is known. I can't wait for Season 3. So yeah, I know I said there are no spoilers. There are like a couple little things there, but they felt kind of broad, so I didn't think they were really spoilery. But yeah, Liana is really into the show, and I'm glad to see she's also looking forward to Season 3. Now, with the musical episode, this for me, I don't stay up late to watch streaming show episodes when they premiere anymore, at midnight on the Pacific Coast. Like, I don't do that anymore with Star Wars, really, or with Marvel or DC. Or I just get, really tired. So this, for the first time in a long time, was the first Star Trek episode that I decided to power through and stay up late to watch when it premiered. Because, I'm getting to a point where I get super tired and just need to get some sleep and wait until morning when I feel like I'll enjoy it more. But for the musical episode Subspace Rhapsody, I powered through. I watched the whole episode when it came out that night, and I was blown away. I loved the music. The songs were incredible. The cast, the characters seemed to be having a lot of fun. And so, yeah, I was just really, really into this. And I've talked to friends in the LA Away Team online book club that I mentioned in the episode, and they really enjoyed the season as well. They mentioned that at Star Trek Las Vegas, the fan convention, there was this panel where Zachary Quinto and Ethan Peck talked about how they prepared for the role of Spock, and they were kind of like, whoa, that's how I prepared to do it too. So it's kind of funny how they're basically kindred spirits, and they're both great as Spock. So it sounds like that convention was a really good time. Now, as for Zach's thoughts on Subspace Rhapsody, I'm just gonna read his tweets here, which I know it's x.com now, which makes this even weirder to say tweet, but it basically, here's what he said. Let me tell you why, and this is kind of a spoiler for the musical episode, so I'd suggest watching that first and then hearing this. Let me tell you why I'm the X is one of the best things to happen to Spock's character. Since the original series, the movies, even in the Kelvin films, Spock's always been unable to grip with his emotions. So often, words fail. So what do you use when words fail? Song. In Those Old Scientists, we see Spock from the standpoint of the viewer thanks to a very meta assignment from Boimler. Spock smiling, happy, and shouldn't be. Chapel appears upset at the news first, but here we quickly see career was always the priority for her. Spock essentially gave up to praying for Chapel, and now he's the one being given up. This not only sets a stage for her and Corby, but also helps him relate to the one he jilted, and explains his solitary nature in other series. Now to the song itself. Spock uses common Vulcan terms when he speaks, saying phrases like I am hurt, but when he breaks into song, he uses a total of 14 contractions, very uncommon for a Vulcan, and a clever writing prose to show how emotionally vulnerable he is. I watched dozens, if not hundreds, of musicals growing up. The writing of this song is next level. I solved for y in my computation, but missed vital information, the variable so devastating, I'm the X. Math, intellect, pain, killer baritone, finally, he can express himself. So yeah, Uhura might have saved the day, but in my opinion, one of Strange New Worlds' greatest character triumphs this particular episode is seeing Spock's pain, how he processes, and how we may see him on the other side of this. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. # Star Trek. So yeah, overall, a very satisfying season, I would say, and my friends would say from the sounds of it. So yeah, loving Star Trek, and also I feel like I should mention that in any universe where Prodigy is halted or doesn't have a home for another season, like the higher ups should higher ups, networks, whatever, should give it a home and have it continue, because it's a great show, it probably in any universe. Also makes for a nice gateway for younger audiences to get into Star Trek. So yeah, definitely pro Prodigy here. And I'm also pro Lower Decks as well. That crossover, I really loved it. It was kind of meta and it really worked. So yeah, I really enjoyed this second season of Strange New Worlds. But all that being said, let's get on to Babylon 5. So first, non-spoiler stuff. So Babylon 5, I got into it like 2013 at the earliest. I definitely finished it in 2014. Probably watched the bulk of it that year. I found out about it because I submitted an essay about why I enjoy writing or being a writer, and I won an assist from J. Michael Straczynski and his collaborators. I'm not sure what the right term is, but yeah, that was before I went into college. And after I won that, I was told about the stuff he's worked on, and Babylon 5 was one of them. And this was the first time I ever heard of the show. So I was renting the DVDs from Netflix back when they mailed DVDs. Like, yeah, I guess what we're learning on this episode is it all goes back to Netflix, you know? So I was watching that as I was getting into all these other sci-fi shows. You know, I did a full watch through of Doctor Who in the latter part of 2013. Got into Farscape and Quantum Leap the year after, and finished Star Trek. All the televised Star Trek that was available sometime in 2014. So this was such a great spot for me in my life, like getting into all these different sci-fi series and franchises. And Babylon 5 had some of the things I loved about Star Wars and some of the things I loved about Star Trek. It was like the best of both worlds, but while being its own unique thing. Now, obviously, there's the accounts of how, like, you can read about this in Straczynski's autobiography, Becoming Superman. I actually met him at a book signing for that back in 2019. It was pretty close to my birthday, from what I remember. It's a great book, and there's an account of how the premise for Babylon 5, while it was being pitched, may have been reworked by Paramount, and so that's why you see some similarities with Deep Space Nine and Babylon 5. And in the end, they felt different enough overall. But overall, Babylon 5, I ended up preferring a bit. Like, Babylon 5 ended up being my favorite sci-fi show of all time. It's just a really tightly written 5-season arc. And even when there had to be casting changes, like a cast member who was the main character in the first season had to leave due to health reasons, and then they brought in a new main character. And when you think about that on paper, that shouldn't work, but it ended up working, and they brought back the original main character, you know, Jeffrey Sinclair, and John Sheridan became the new main character. And Sinclair's arc does get resolved, and it's really great. But yeah, Sheridan and the other characters like Delenn, Jakar, Londo, I could go on and on. They were just so colorful, and they change over time. Some people you begin the series not liking so much and then end up really liking them toward the end, and perhaps vice versa. And it's such a masterclass in writing, and it's part of why I think 5 seasons really should be the standard for, like, I feel like going beyond 5, you know, sometimes it can be justified, but I can think of a few shows where it feels like they meant to stop at 5, or they could have stopped at 5 and it would have been fine. But yeah, I love the series. I've probably gone through it 3 times from what I remember. I watched it again when it was on a site called Go7, I think it was. And I think that went down under. Like, it was an official site, and then, yeah. And then later on when it was on Max. And now I've pre-ordered the complete series now that it's coming out all on Blu-ray in December, and I'm really pleased with that. This is my first time ever buying a TV series, really, and buying Babylon 5 The Road Home, the new animated movie, was my first time buying a movie for myself on physical media since perhaps Terminator Salvation. Funny enough, Straczynski wrote a conclusion to that via a comic series called Terminator Salvation: The Final Battle. It was pretty good. But yeah, I enjoyed the Babylon 5 series, watched the movies and the spin-offs. Crusade didn't continue after 1 season, unfortunately, and Legend of the Rangers, you know, was a pilot and didn't continue, but maybe there are some universes where they do, who knows. When it comes to the movies, I don't, like, most of them I don't enjoy as much as the show. Like, they're fine, but the prequel movie, The Beginning, I think is really good, and The Gathering is definitely essential watching, like the pilot movie. So going into Babylon 5 The Road Home, I wasn't really sure what to expect. I think I definitely enjoy it more than most of the Babylon 5 movies, but maybe slightly below in the beginning or a bit below that. So yeah, I'm glad I bought it. And it has commentary and a special feature called Babylon 5 Forever, I think it's called. If I get that wrong, I'll put it in the show notes. So I'm glad I bought it. I watched it. The animation feels reminiscent of such shows as Star Wars Resistance and The Dragon Prince, and I'm sure you can name a lot of other shows that look like that, but those are kind of like where my mind went first. I'd also like to add that with the animated movie, the effects in the original show where there's a CGI and it looks like a video game, and it didn't bother me because the storytelling was so good. But with the animated movie, you don't really have that problem. Like, it just all looks really good. And, this is in the trailer, so it's not a spoiler, but it delves into the multiverse, funny enough. Like, on this delayed replay episode, we were talking about the multiverse trend, and I'm really curious, like, when exactly did the idea for this story come about? Like, how far along was the multiverse trend that we're so inundated with now? But it was an interesting watch. You get to see, I guess we're going to spoilers now for the movie. I'll give my, I'd say my overall score is a 7.5 out of 10 Zathras or Zathras's. Like, it's fine. It maybe a little bit more than fine. It takes John Sheridan to different timelines, different realities. So knowing that was going to be the premise, I kind of felt like it was going to be pretty much what I expected, and I feel like it was overall. But there is a nice theme of how across all realities, love is the most powerful thing. And, that's something that's touched upon in Everything, Everywhere, All at Once as well. And seeing the different versions of the familiar characters, we even got to see Sinclair again. And I feel like we maybe found out a bit too much about Zathras. All the Zathras clones and stuff. Like, it was interesting. He did break the fourth wall at one point when Sheridan is like, we're lost in time and lost in, and he cuts him off before he can say lost in space. And Zathras is like, even now, copyright is an issue. And like, that really took me out of the movie. Even though it's animated, it feels like it has the grounded feel of Babylon 5, but also not as grounded because he flings Sheridan across all these different realities. Is a fun journey, I guess, but the ending really has me wondering, like, what's next? Because we're introduced to a reality that's kind of different and is earlier in these characters' journeys, but in a different timeline, and they look pretty much the same. Like, look like the same actor character models. So I don't think this timeline that they sort of linger on at the end is supposed to be the timeline that'll be explored in the CW reboot. I'm Steven of that other universe. I don't know if I clarified that. Maybe it's already started in the delayed replay universe. I don't know. There's just so much to keep track of. But yeah, I don't think it's necessarily directly leading into the CW reboot show, which I'm very excited to see what goes down with that. Like, how does it change up the story while also maintaining the core of Babylon 5? But I do think maybe this ending sets up another reboot timeline that could be explored in animated movies, if there are further animated movies. I guess I'll depend on how much this one sells. So I'm curious to see what Warner Brothers ends up deciding, what the impact on from the fans might have on everything. But right now, it really feels like we're having a Babylon 5 resurgence, and I'm very happy about that. The road home wasn't the greatest thing ever, but it was enjoyable enough. And Lane Straczynski do his thing. We it'll be he made like such great things for the original show, so I'm really want to see how he does it with the new show. So I'm very excited about that. Even as a fan of the original show, I know lots of people are like, "Oh, it's sacrilege to redo it," but I'm like, I'm fine. Like, I want to see a new take on it. But yeah, watch any of this Babylon 5 stuff for yourself. If you don't believe me, it's definitely worth your time. All right, so I guess that's it for this episode. I think I did all the plugs. I'm on Letterboxd, Goodreads, and yada yada yada. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this really long episode. But without further delay, have a good day.